Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, it isn't really rocket science here. In war, two of the most important objectives is to collapse both an enemy's will and capacity to fight. And it now appears that Russia is ramping up their endgame strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we don't talk about Ukraine a lot, as we've always said. Unless there's something worth talking about, then we're not going to discuss it because, frankly, regurgitating information that 50 other channels are copying off each other adds no value to anything. And it always comes back to the point, really, to comment on operational things, logistics, tactics, etc. You have to have served in the military. You have to have a military education background, and you also have to have experience. And if you haven't, then really I ask the question, why are people talking about it? So, but in this case, I think there are things, very obvious things going on, things that we can talk about because they've happened, and also because of things that have been going on for a few months. And a lot of this revolves around the issue of energy or energy storage capability. And at the end of the day, if you look at last winter, to put it mildly, Ukraine really got through it by the skin of their teeth with regards to their gas reserves and their capability to last through what is called the heating season, because the heating season has effectively begun now, to all intents and purposes. And what is very clear, if you go back around about 5, 6 weeks ago, and you look at the gas reserves that Ukraine had accumulated in its underground storage facilities, they were probably 2 to 2.5 billion cubic meters short of what they perceived they required by November of this year. Now, the argument is, well, how easy is it for them to get the 2.5 billion cubic meters, bearing in mind they're at war? But more importantly, how are they going to finance it? Now, I know people will say, well, they can just tap the Europeans or whoever for the money to do so. Well, it's never that simple because if you go back during the summer months and what they were importing, it was considerably less than they required simply because they couldn't afford to do it. And they are going to have to find a shortfall of money to be able to buy the gas anyway. And then the problem is, even if the plan of trying to buy up 2.5 billion cubic meters of gas to last the winter comes to fruition, the problem is that may prove to be wholly insufficient because, as we know, and this has been going on year after year, throughout the year, Russia keeps hitting strikes on energy infrastructure, energy production, and therefore, when times get desperate, they're going to have to import gas if they can at massively inflated prices. The other problem is because the economy and financial systems in total disarray in Ukraine. They've got enormous debts accrued by for households and obviously corporations, businesses, whatever's left in a war-torn country that have exceeded probably or getting on for about 180 billion now. What is it? I never can pronounce that currency. How do you say
Grivna?
Nivium or
Grivna.
Nivea? The
Grivna. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Thank goodness Ken's here. And obviously, what's happening for the Ukrainian gas company, Naftogaz, they are having to sell gas below cost. They're incurring huge losses, and therefore that undermines their capability to be able to accrue future purchases. In addition, of course, one of the big problems and has been is this is all assuming that if they can get that, that Russia's attacks on gas infrastructure, gas transportation, storage facilities doesn't happen. Well, we're going to come on to discuss exactly what has been happening. And therefore, if facilities get damaged or destroyed, then all of a sudden there is a risk that Ukraine is going to suffer shortages it cannot manage to deal with. I mean, because of course, Ukraine has neither Russian nor Azerbaijani gas, and therefore they, potentially this is a huge problem. So I'm presenting that as background so people can understand the problems that Ukraine's facing in terms of its access to imported gas and in a broad sense the problems they're facing being able to purchase it because of all the financial difficulties as well. And it's kind of interesting. You would have logically have thought the one thing the West would have done is to make sure institutions like Gas didn't have these problems, because surely you would think that having energy security in Ukraine was of utmost importance. Well, apparently it doesn't seem to be the case, and this again shows the stupidity of the West in trying to claim to be supportive for Ukraine's war effort.
Well, and you also take into consideration that Kiev has been recently trying to do the very same thing, going after Russia's energy, refineries and such, even to the point of sending a drone as far as Siberia, which makes me wonder. I don't think Kiev itself has the logistics or the capability to do it on their own. So they're getting support from European or American, I don't know which, either intelligence or some support in that capacity. So they recognize as well that as we head towards winter, that type of attacks have the potential to not only slow down the war efforts and the war machine of Russia, but also to demoralize the public. There's a big difference, though. First off, uh, Ukraine has sent most of their able-bodied technicians to the front lines. So if you have this infrastructure destruction, as well as fires and any of those other things, they're not going to have the manpower or the labor to be able to fix it very quickly. As opposed to what you have in Russia, well, they've been in the energy business for decades, if not a century now. So they are very quick and able to fix any type of attacks on their refineries, on their infrastructure, and the like.
Yeah, the other thing about the Russian infrastructure attack, we're not disputing they've happened, but they've been grossly exaggerated by the Ukrainian side. There's all these stories, and I've seen people posting images claiming there's queues for people wanting petrol, diesel, whatever, and it's simply not true. They've got nothing to do with that. So you also have to factor that into the question, but there was apparently warnings given by the Russians saying if you continue to target critical infrastructure like energy facilities or storage facilities or where, then there are going to be serious consequences as a Russian response. And I think it's worth mentioning at this point one of the biggest failings in the West, and they continue to fail to understand this, is that they think Russia's fighting at maximum capacity. It's got nothing else to give. Couldn't be further from the truth. It's absolute nonsense. And it's something that skews people's perspective and also gives a lot of this faux confidence in amongst elements in Western countries in NATO who still think that Russia can be defeated on this basis because Russia's weak, because Russia doesn't have access to resources. Russia's energy resources are being destroyed. I mean, do they not understand even basic, simple arithmetic, basic, simple operational requirements of what Russia's capable of producing, what it does produce, and how, yes, you can have problems, but they are pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. They may cause disruption for a short time in a very limited capacity, but in reality, it is not a long-term problem. But because of all this arrogance, because of shouting their mouth off and making grandiose statements, inevitably at some point, there was going to not just be a typical Russian response, but a massive Russian response. And for me, that is probably the clearest indication that Russia sees this as an opportunity to implement an endgame for the very reasons that Ken started out at the beginning of this, saying how you can demoralize people. And one way to do that is if you destroy huge amounts of their energy infrastructure, then and you can't heat and light a country, you're going to start to totally degrade society and its capability to live, particularly through the winter months. Yes, it is a cynical ploy, there's no doubt, but if Ukraine's going to attack a Russian energy infrastructure, what do you expect the response will be? Nothing. Of course, they were going to do this. But there's already admissions in the Western media that Russia had destroyed 60% of Ukraine's gas production. So that immediately eats into what I mentioned about requiring 2.5 billion cubic meters of gas. I mean, how much more do we have to add to that figure? It just is something that becomes literally intolerable. And this is why there was, even the Ukrainians said that Russia carried out this massive attack recently on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It left parts of the capital, Kiev, without power. Now, yes, Russia's used these tactics in the past, but it looks as though they are going really laying down the gauntlet with this now, because they're targeting energy generating facilities, gas production, distribution, and targeting all aspects of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And I think even Zelensky came out and said they'd used more than 450 drones and 30 missiles. They're depriving us of things that sustain normal life. Well, yes, and they are targeting this energy infrastructure ahead of the heating season. There's no prizes for guessing why they're doing it, and they can very quickly cause huge problems in large, population centers like Kiev. And here's the thing, if they cause enough damage, and that's the big risk in this, you may start to displace people out these cities who'll go, well, we can't survive here. But where are they going to go? Other cities that have been destroyed? All of a sudden, you start to really significantly impact the very well-being of huge swathes of people in the country. And that therefore becomes a humanitarian crisis in of itself. And therefore you're going to start to see people trying to pile over borders again. They're going to be refused. And the question is, does Russia see this as a way of causing so much impacting the civilian population that there is going to be ramifications, and that could quite easily accelerate the end of the war, because if you lose support of the population and they become so demoralized and really, they've just reached the end of the line in trying to cope with what's gone on for 3.5 years, then the war could end on that basis rather quickly.
Yeah, and there's a sort of historical aspect we can look at this. Back in 2009, there was a major gas dispute between Russia and Ukraine. And so the natural gas was cut off at that time. And there was a lot of turmoil in France, especially because they were getting cut off from the natural gas. But there were reports of many people dying in Eastern Europe because of it. Now imagine something like that, only for an entire country, widespread. And because of what happened with the pipeline that led to Hungary, Ukraine and especially Kiev gets a lot of their electricity from Eastern Europe, those countries. And that has been primarily cut off. So they're not getting the support they used to get from Europe. And if they get all their internal infrastructure destroyed, there's really no capacity for, they're going to be having to worry about domestic widespread freezes, as well as the ability to bring food to the cities, etc., than to even worry about having to make strikes into Russia or even support the front.
Yeah, and that's the big thing. And whilst we mentioned Kiev, it's worth also mentioning that these attacks by Russia on energy infrastructure was across the country. Well, I mean, predominantly, obviously in the east. So obviously, it was in Zaporozhye, in Dnipro, in Poltava, in Kharkov, in Kiev, and other regions. So people have been left without power. And how long is it going to take them to fix it? Well, the argument is increasingly that is going to become more and more of a problem. There are people not just without electricity and gas, but also without water. How long can a country survive without water? Yeah, you can say, well, we can restore the water supply, and they probably can fix that reasonably quickly. But this is a cumulative problem. And if, for argument's sake, Ukraine has a harsh winter, and even go typical winters in parts of Ukraine, it's pretty harsh winter, it's pretty cold. That if they have a particularly harsh one and Russia continues with this bombardment of energy infrastructure and destroys even more gas production capability, etc., then they're going to have a massive, massive energy shortfall. And there's no way you can ship this energy in tankers or whatever. It's just not fit. It's not possible to do this. So they're going to be left in a situation where that's going to massively impact their capability to fight whatever capability they have in the context of the war itself, which is increasingly very limited. But also, it's going to affect the civilian population, and that is clearly then a huge problem. And I think this is a tactic that the Russians want to deploy. And I think they will continue to do so. And they see it as a way to potentially end the war quickly because the civilian population in the end will not be able to cope. And you can't fight a war when there are potentially millions and millions of Ukrainians in dire straits because of a lack of access to energy, water supplies, and ultimately, as you said, Ken, then it starts to affect their ability to import anything and what's going to happen to basic food supplies, etc. It starts to become a massive problem.
I think one final thing to take a look at it from my end is uh, the U.S., i.e., the Trump administration, has been focused the last few weeks on the conflict in West Asia, the Gaza, Palestine. Now that that allegedly, we'll see, is has been taken care of, it's more than likely that Trump is going to change his focus back over to Ukraine, thinking that, oh, I can solve everything, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's a perfect time then to not only seize the amount of territory that they need to, but also put Kiev into a situation where they have to capitulate and where the United States, as well as NATO slash EU, sees the writing on the wall and forces Zelensky to have to come to a capitulation and a resignation of the conflict. So I think it's a perfect two-step scenario where you make it so obvious to the West that Ukraine can no longer really support a conflict, and then the West is going to have to come hat in hand and say, Zelensky, you're done. Russia, what do we need to end this thing?
Well, that's an extremely good point because that could get to that. Because at the end of the day, you can give Ukraine as much money as you want. If they haven't got the resources, they haven't got the energy, they increasingly don't have the manpower to fight a war or the weapons, etc., to fight a war. What are they, what are they fighting with? So it could well be that that's kind of a thought process, certainly that will be going on in the Rush months. But I do think it doesn't mean the war ends, but the sooner the war ends, the better. But it might be seen as an opportunity to, they carry on along the front line, they'll keep doing what they're doing, but they might continue to push home this energy infrastructure destruction because they see that's a way to end the war very rapidly. And if the war ends very rapidly, then, then that will be a situation where then whatever the Americans are threatening to do or not do with regards to Tomahawks, which is really just a massively overblown story because the Americans have got very little to give them and there's no guarantees they're going to give them. And without the Americans, they can't launch them and they haven't really got any launchers available to give to them because they're elsewhere in the world. And it's going to take many, many months for that to become even a reality, if it is a reality. So this might be seen as an opportunity to end the war rather quickly. And from the Americans' perspective, the sooner the war's over, the better, because it's a millstone around their necks that they want shot off. Pardon the use of that word.
Yeah, indeed. Any other thoughts you wanted to add to this, Paul?
No, I think that's fine.
Perfect. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.